All right, so if you're into Bible prophecy, you've almost certainly heard this one. It's a really big idea that the abomination of desolation is going to happen at the exact, precise midpoint of a future 7-year period. And that event is what kicks off the Great Tribulation. It's pretty much a cornerstone of how a lot of people see the end times.
And you can see why this timeline is so popular, right? It's super clean, it's symmetrical, everything fits together so neatly. It gives this really clear, elegant structure to what can be some very confusing prophecies. And that simplicity, well, that's a huge part of its appeal. But here's the big question we're digging into today. Does the Bible itself actually demand this exact timing? Is this midpoint view a hard and fast rule written in the text, or is it an interpretation? A really logical and plausible one, for sure, that we've just gotten comfortable with. So let's do a little textual investigation.
Okay, so let's get into our investigation. Exhibit A comes straight out of the book of Daniel, and honestly, it throws a bit of a wrench into the whole idea of a perfectly simple timeline. The wording here is absolutely crucial. Listen to what Daniel 12, verse 11 actually says. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Did you catch that? The verse names two distinct actions.
So the common assumption is that we kind of squish these two things together into one single event. But if you look closer, the text itself lists them as two separate items. Number 1, the sacrifice is abolished, and number 2, the abomination is set up. The verse never actually says they happen at the exact same time.
And that forces us to ask a really important question. Does the language here require these two things to be simultaneous? The text totally allows for a different possibility, that abolishing the sacrifice is what starts the countdown, and the abomination being set up is another major event that happens during that time.
All right, moving on to Exhibit B. This one takes us to the book of Revelation, and things get, well, a little complicated for the standard view. We find a kind of symbolic tension here.
In Revelation chapter 11, the Apostle John is told to, quote, measure the temple of God and the altar, but do not measure the court outside the temple, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. Now pay close attention to that contrast. Something is being measured, while something else is being trampled. And this is where it gets really interesting. On the one hand, you have the holy city being trampled, total desecration for 42 months. But at the exact same time, the inner temple is being measured. And in prophecy, when God measures something, it's often a symbol of his ownership and his protection over it. It's his way of saying, this part is still mine. So, how can both be true? If the Antichrist is in the temple, desecrating it from the very start of the 42 months, how is it also being divinely measured and preserved by God for that entire time? It creates a real textual puzzle, one that the standard model usually just kind of has to skim over by saying the measuring part isn't all that significant. And for our final piece of evidence, Exhibit C, we're going to listen to the words of Jesus himself in Matthew's Gospel. And the key thing to listen for here is the order of events, not a specific date. In Matthew 24, Jesus lays out this super clear sequence. He says, so when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee, for then there will be great tribulation. It's an unmistakable chain of events. You see the abomination, then you flee, because then comes the great tribulation. And here we go again, right? We see this difference between what we assume and what the text actually says. The midpoint view brings in the assumption that this sequence has to be locked into the 3.5-year mark. But Jesus himself doesn't mention a date. He just describes the trigger and what happens next. It's about cause and effect, not a calendar date. So, bottom line, Matthew's text doesn't prove the midpoint timing on its own. That timing is an idea we bring to the text, not something we get from it. The passage confirms the Great Tribulation follows the abomination, sure, but it doesn't pin it to a specific day. Okay, so let's put it all together. What do our three exhibits from Daniel, Revelation, and Matthew all point to? Well, they highlight a bigger issue in how we sometimes interpret these things, something we can call the problem of compression. Basically, the traditional view takes all these different events, the sacrifice stopping, the beast being enthroned, the temple being desecrated, the Great Tribulation kicking off, and it compresses them all into one single synchronized moment. Boom, everything happens at once, the 42-month clock starts ticking,
But as we've just seen, the actual textual evidence for that is more assumed than it is proven. And this gets to a really important principle when we're reading scripture. Just because a model is neat and tidy doesn't automatically make it correct. Interpretive neatness shouldn't be mistaken for textual necessity. It's very possible the Bible is preserving distinctions that our nice, clean charts end up flattening out. I mean, just look at this. If you want to argue that the midpoint view is textually required, that it's the only way, you have to prove that Daniel 12 demands that everything happens at once. You have to prove that Revelation's measuring is insignificant. And you have to prove that Matthew 24 fixes a mathematical date. But as you can see, each of those claims rests on an assumption, not something the text explicitly says. The burden of proof for being that certain is actually pretty high. Now, let me be super clear here. The goal of this isn't to say the midpoint view is wrong. It's absolutely a plausible, logical way to arrange these events. The goal is to see the difference between plausibility and inevitability. Is it one possible interpretation, or is it the only one the scriptures demand? And the evidence we've looked at suggests it's the former.
So let's just run through our key takeaways. First, Daniel 12 separates two actions. Second, Revelation 11 gives us that tension between desecration and preservation. Third, Matthew 24 gives us a sequence, not a calendar date. And finally, the certainty of that whole midpoint model really depends on compressing these distinct points all together.
Which brings us to our final conclusion. The issue isn't that the midpoint view is impossible, not at all. The central problem is that its certainty is often overstated. A careful reading of these texts suggests there might be more chronological openness, more wiggle room than the traditional model usually allows for. And that leaves us with a final, pretty important question to think about. If the timing of this critical event isn't as rigidly fixed as we've often assumed, what does that mean for how we understand the flow and the triggers of these end-time events? It suggests we should probably approach all of these prophetic texts with a real appreciation for the nuance and maybe even the flexibility that they contain.